It's my privilege and pleasure as patron to welcome you to Vietnam 30/50 and this two-day conference. And as I have said on many previous conferences, and again for the record, Military History and Heritage Victoria was officially launched on the 4th of May 2011 by Professor Geoffrey Blaney, which makes it now our 15th anniversary, so we might have a birthday cake. At that opening, Geoffrey challenged us to be relevant, and you've heard, those that have attended previous conferences, you've heard it all before, but I believe we have managed that challenge particularly well. And also for the record, this is the 21st such activity in those 15 years. However, back to this 6th biennial two-day conference, Vietnam and its 50th anniversary at the end of its 30-year war. We believe that this conference covers an important period in our history that was divisive to us at home, controversial to many, and in some ways we were not ready, once again, for it. And or the way of fighting in a divided Vietnam civilian population. Also, the legacy or the aftermath is also very intriguing, and that total area will be covered for us over the next 2 days. I believe we've convened a balanced but a diversified program for you, and again with another excellent cast of presenters. May I acknowledge here and thank the convener of this two-day conference, Andrew Kilsby, who has brought together a program that covers such an important post-World War II phase in our history. All of it for 80 years. May I also acknowledge our Military History and Heritage Victoria sponsors, and they are listed at the foot of your programs. Particularly this venue, the Rats of Tobruk Association and Tobruk House, who responded swiftly to our necessary change of venue caused by the unfortunate fire at the Waverley RSL Club. Also may I acknowledge our colleagues of the History League here and Big Sky Publishing. But of special note, and you'll have to read this, it's from America and the Texas Technology, I'll use Institute in my language, and its name is wonderful, the Vietnam Centre and Sam Johnston Vietnam Archive. You'll find that in very small print also on the back. But the person I'm referring to is its director, Dr. Stephen Maxner. He's here with us and he will be providing the keynote address. Finally, to you the attendees, once again, thank you for attending. I trust you enjoy the program, and I, once again, for many conferences, am certainly looking forward to it. But now, may I introduce our President, Colonel Mike Buckridge, as the first session chair to intro our keynote speaker from Texas, Dr. Stephen Maxner. Michael.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to all our speakers. but also welcome to all our listeners. We couldn't manage this very well without an audience, so if you're not a presenter, a listener like me, you're making an important contribution too. I've got a couple of housekeeping things just to mention. In case you haven't found it, down the far right bottom corner is where there is a unisex toilet. And that's the one we've got. It has a ladies' sign on the door, but I'm reliably informed that it's for both of us. There is a cubicle inside with another lady's sign on it. I think we might treat that as sacrosanct. I've also been asked to let you know that Neil Legge maintains a database of the Officer Training Unit at Tobruk, the Vietnam era Officer Training Unit. And he would be very happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk about issues to do with Skybelt over the course of the next 2 days. Now, I'd like to add my thanks to those of General Barry to the Rats of Tobruk Association. They've made this possible for us out of an emergency situation, and I think it could be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So thanks to them. The last thing I want to do before I get to the main point of my being here is to acknowledge the contribution over many years to our conferences of Professor Emeritus David Horner, who was to be speaking at this conference, but who has been stricken with motor neurone disease and sadly won't be coming to us again. He's been a stalwart supporter of our programs, and we wish him and his family all the best in treatment and care into the future. And now, back to the present. Dr. Stephen Maxner, who's going to present us with our keynote address, has had a career. I'm not going to read everything in his bio, you've got that in your paper, but I will comment on it. He's had a career that began in the US Army, but continued both in the Army and in academia. He has a master's degree and a doctorate in history, and if that doesn't turn you into a historian, what does? And he's focused his academic work on the Vietnam War and all the issues surrounding that war. I have to admit, I didn't know about the preeminent Vietnam focus of the Texas Tech University until now, but I'm very glad I do now, because it's obviously the place in which to find people of genuine expertise in the area, backed by all the documents you could imagine. So I'm very pleased and honoured that Stephen's been willing to come and speak to us here today, and I'll ask you to welcome him in the usual fashion.
No, I don't trust that. Thank you.
I'll give you a bell at 25 minutes.
Okay, very good. I need someone to keep time. Teach classes at Texas Tech. They're typically either 50 minutes or an hour and 20 minutes long. And so, pick your poison, how long you want me to speak. But I'll try to keep my time to the allotted 25 minutes, and I'll even set a little timer to help remind myself that I need to just be quiet at some point and let you guys ask questions. But it's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. And I'd like to start by thanking, of course, our host here at Tobruk House. What a wonderful facility this is. I want to thank Lieutenant Colonel Buckridge for his very kind introduction. And I'd like to thank Major General Jim Barry, the conference chair of Military History and Heritage Victoria, Major General Michael Bryan, president of Royal United Services Institute Victoria, and Andrew Kilsby, who so graciously organized this conference and invited me to be with you today. And this is a very humbling experience for me, to be a keynote speaker with veterans, with scholars, and with with folks who take the history of the Vietnam War, the history of Australian forces and war more broadly, so very seriously. And I'm so honored to be here with you. So I've been asked to discuss the end of the Vietnam War and the normalization of relations. And it's interesting, the 30-50 number sequence that you guys use for this, which is 50 years of war, 30 years of peace, or reflection. 30 years of war, 50 years of reflection, excuse me. For us, the 30-50 number represents the 50th anniversary of the end of the war and the 30th anniversary of normalized relations with Vietnam. Of course, you guys really beat us to the punch on that, right? Australia will normalize relations all the way back to 73, is that correct? I mean, it was a long time ago. And so, you know, we were way behind the curve on that one. We caught up in terms of the strategic partnership of 2018 for Australia and then 2023 for the United States. But still, Australia had such a vision for, you know, how do we reconcile this war? And how do we move forward, move past it? And so it just took us quite a bit longer to get where you are. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that happened. But when I discuss today the 30th and the 50th, those are the numbers that I'm thinking in terms of 50 years after the war and 30 years after normalization. But as you all know, this is no small task in terms of addressing these issues. A lot's happened since April 30th of 1975. As such, I'll highlight what I think are some of the more salient issues on the road from being mortal enemies with Vietnam to being strong allies. Of course, this is nothing new in the history of diplomacy during the second half of the 20th century. The enemies to allies kind of programs, if you will, that followed World War II with the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Germany, Italy, Japan, and other nations, making them strong allies, is of course a testament to that spirit. But it's easy to be magnanimous in victory. Something made the post-Vietnam War experience different, more challenging, and of course rather special, because we were not the victors in that conflict. And that made that post-war reconciliation a bit more challenging. So when the Vietnam War ended on April 30th of 1975, the world looked on in shock as the United States and our allies, the Republic of Vietnam, lost what was arguably the second most significant and impactful hot war during the Cold War. The award for the most significant and impactful hot war during the Cold War goes to the former Soviet Union in their hot war with Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. Of course, that's a discussion for another day, or perhaps over a schooner or Baltic XPA after the conference concludes this afternoon. For anybody who's game, I looked that up. I heard that Melbourne, this is the home for Baltic XPA. I'm looking forward to trying this. But for now, and for the U.S. in '75, many perceived the loss in Vietnam as a first. The first time the United States lost a war since the nation's founding. Of course, that wasn't necessarily true. The United States technically had our collective hats handed to us during the War of 1812 when the British burnt the Capitol, of course captured territory in Maine and the Midwest. But we kind of ignored that because, of course, the Treaty of Ghent resulted in the aftermath of the successful Battle of New Orleans, of course, and that's what we latched on to. Andrew Jackson and New Orleans. But regardless, as an ongoing extension of American perceptions of manifest destiny, the national possession of what we perceive to be God's divine favor, providence, the loss in Vietnam hit the American psyche very hard. And the tangible losses were substantial. The U.S. military forces suffered some 58,000 plus killed and more than 303,000 wounded. The U.S. also suffered direct costs of more than $168 billion, which is equivalent of about $1 trillion today. Meanwhile, the intangible losses were also devastating. The perception that the United States government had consistently lied and hid the truth from the American people forever changed the political landscape of the country. Discrepancies between wartime statements by government officials and military officials and the wartime media created a crisis of confidence and the growth of what we can call the credibility gap. The American people didn't know who to believe, and increasingly, they grew to think that they could no longer or not always believe what the government was telling them. Combined with the very public revelations from the Pentagon Papers, the effects of Agent Orange on veterans, along with numerous other wartime and post-war issues, the Vietnam War resulted in a general sense of mistrust in the government that didn't exist to this level before and has only continued to grow since. Politically, the war also created deeper mistrust between two of the branches of government, the legislative and the executive branches. Short of a declaration of victory and with the anticlimactic withdrawal of the United States forces in 1973, the U.S. Congress passed the War Powers Resolution in 1973, significantly curtailing the power of the U.S. President to deploy U.S. military forces without congressional sanction, and as a direct response to the perceived expansion of executive powers during the Vietnam War. Of course, there's a bit of duplicity in this, right? After all, it was the U.S. Congress who voted with near unanimity in favor of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964. To remind you, it was a 504-2 vote. Everyone in the House of Representatives voted in favor, only 2 voted against in the Senate. And so it's kind of hard, it's kind of duplicitous to say, oh no, you shouldn't have been using that kind of power when Congress was the one who handed it to the presidents. That resolution granted Presidents Johnson and Nixon with near unlimited power to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia. But from the perspective of Congress, that would never happen again. Or has it? This is the topic for another drink, right? When combined with the human loss of life, along with the other tangible and intangible losses made the Vietnam War a profound and lasting consequence for the United States and for the American people. Of course, many other nations suffered substantial and horrific losses because of the war. U.S. allies had thousands killed and many more thousands wounded. Australia alone suffered more than 500 killed and approximately 3,000 wounded. I know someone out there is going to correct me later on, and that's cool. I get that. Because my numbers might not be perfect. But the most horrific Allied losses were suffered by our allies, the Republic of Vietnam, whose citizens lost so much more than the United States or anyone else. Military casualties for the armed forces of the Republic are estimated at approximately 300,000 killed and approximately 750,000 wounded. Civilian casualties in the Republic of Vietnam are estimated to be about 400,000 killed and another 900,000 wounded. In addition to that incredible loss of human life, the people of South Vietnam suffered incredible levels of displacement during the war, with more than 3 million refugees forced from their homes and lands. And then, of course, on April 30th of 1975, the citizens of the Republic of Vietnam lost their country, their homes, their businesses, everything. Hundreds of thousands fled and became refugees in the United States, Australia, and numerous other countries. And that has been an incredibly lasting aspect of the war. These Vietnamese diasporic communities throughout the world that resulted from what happened on April 30th. Of course, North Vietnamese losses were also horrific, equally staggering. Most recent official government estimates are approximately 1.1 million military deaths between 1955 and 1975. The Ministry of National Defense of Vietnam has a lower total for the war with the United States at 900,000 killed, with approximately 600,000 killed due to combat operations. Now that last number, 600,000 from the Ministry of National Defense, is remarkably consistent with U.S. estimates, but in a rather peculiar way. Immediate post-war estimates of PAVN and National Liberation Front losses by the United States, this is a calculation by us, approximately 900,000 killed based on body counts from the Vietnam War. Now, given the proclivity of some units to exaggerate the body counts in reports that were sent to higher headquarters, intelligence analysts concluded and recommended that we needed to apply a 30% deflation rule to that number, bringing the revised and probably more accurate combat body count down to approximately 600,000. So, kind of interesting that after the war, we finally come to a very similar number in terms of the impact of combat operations on the North Vietnamese. In addition to the combat losses, civilian casualties in North Vietnam added an additional 65,000 killed and 100,000 wounded to that human costs of lost life and suffering. Now, I know this recitation of facts is a little news to most of you in the audience, but I think it's important to remember them as we discuss the end of the war, the challenges faced in the process of normalizing relations, and the continuing impact and role of those wartime and post-war issues as we recently commemorate the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, and for the United States, the 30th anniversary of normalized relations. Why did it take us so long to get where we are today? And more recently, as we have entered this new period of U.S.-Vietnam relations with a comprehensive strategic partnership. So the United States, of course, immediately after Saigon fell, we responded with economic sanctions. We basically expanded the economic sanctions against both North and South, now Southern Vietnam. We, of course, imposed a comprehensive trade embargo against the newly unified Vietnam. And this was immediate. That actually happened on April 30th of 1975. Saigon fell, we imposed sanctions, and we imposed this embargo. For the next 2 decades, the United States acted to thwart Vietnam from receiving any forms of international assistance through international regional organizations, things like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, ASEAN, and others. The rationalization behind these actions remained the Cold War and concerns regarding the spread of communism. Meanwhile, on the home front, the United States remained simultaneously conflicted about, obsessed with, and of course, dismissive of the Vietnam War. And especially dismissive of Vietnam War veterans. And that was something that so many of our veterans had to grapple with. They returned home to a nation that was basically either ambivalent or hostile. And that contributed, I think, a lot to the suffering that they felt and, of course, the moral harm that they felt in the aftermath of the war. They returned to an ungrateful nation. And all they were doing was what our nation asked of them. So much of this international turmoil was reflected in historical writing about the war in American, and also in American popular culture, to include literature and film. The history of the Vietnam War was written in real time, with numerous scholars, journalists, and wartime participants writing extensively about the conflict as the nation experienced that conflict. Authors like David Halberstam, Neil Sheehan, Francis Fitzgerald, Seymour Hersh, Bernard Fall, Michael Hare, and Jeffrey Race. Oh, and let me also mention Kate Webb, the Australian New Zealander, but also Australian journalist. These were all authors who were writing about the war in real time to help us better understand what was happening in Southeast Asia during that time. They established what became called the Orthodox School of Interpretation about the war. And while some of their opinions differed regarding the intentions of the United States in starting the war, and that ranged from the war reflecting basically innocent intentions but bad implementation, to others thinking that this was a war that reflected nothing but American greed and imperialistic avarice. But whether well-intended or not, they all agreed the United States military intervention in Vietnam was a mistake, and the war was unwinnable. With the end of the war, the Orthodox school continued to dominate academic discussion, to include the works of George Herring, things like America's Longest War, the Stanley Carnow, Bill Diker, Larry Berman, and others. Shortly after the war ended, the revisionist scholars emerged, and they started to talk about the war in completely different terms. This included authors like Dr. Louis and Colonel Harry Summers, of course an American officer who served in Vietnam, and these revisionists held that in fact the war was justified, the war was moral, and more importantly, the war was winnable. So a complete juxtaposition to what the Orthodox school had presented previously. The same interpretation is held by more revisionist scholars today, authors like Mark Moyer, Louis Sorley, Michael Lind, and C. Dale Walton. They all are also contributing to this interpretation that the Vietnam War was a moral war, it was a just war, and it was a winnable war. Now, following the revisionists come another interesting school in terms of academic scholarship. And again, I think these all combine together to help inform what happens in the United States and also how the United States approaches Vietnam. And this is the internationalist or Vietnam-centric scholars that emerge. They differ substantially from the previous two schools in that most of their scholarship is based on access to archives. In Vietnam, the National Archives Center 2, in Ho Chi Minh City, Archive Center 3 in Hanoi. So they're using Vietnamese sources to help better understand what was happening during that conflict. Also, they were able, many of these scholars were also able to gain access to historical materials of the People's Republic of China archives, as well as former Soviet archives, Russian archives. And so they're taking a much broader view of what happened in Southeast Asia, and as a result, they're looking at the war through a completely different lens, where previously very American-centric, now we're broadening that and looking at what was happening throughout the world, and how naive have we been in our interpretations of that conflict. Scholars like Lien Hang Nguyen at Columbia, Pierre Asselin, Ed Miller at Dartmouth. But these are new interpretations that were giving the Vietnamese, both North and South, more agency, recognizing that they have control over their own decisions, their own destinies. These scholars provide a more nuanced appraisal and understanding of both sides of the 17th parallel to include their governments, their peoples, and their leaders. So the debate between scholars of the Vietnam War is much like the title of U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's second volume of his supposed mea culpa series, namely that this is an argument without end. And boy, is it ever, right? This is an ongoing debate and discussion. It's never going to stop. But that ongoing debate has played an important role in framing the Vietnam War within the broader context of U.S. foreign policy and military history. The question remains as to whether or not the United States has learned lessons from that conflict. And perhaps another topic for another Spooner the Ball chair at some point. But in addition to this ongoing U.S. fascination with the Vietnam War within academia, we have an incredible fascination with that conflict in American television and film. For me personally, my earliest recollections of the Vietnam War on TV are seeing President Richard Nixon talking about something. I suspect it was probably Watergate, and because I was born in 65, so 72, 73, I wouldn't have been too mindful of what was happening around the world. But anyway, I saw the president on the TV, I remember that. And also, I remember watching a TV that depicted a Vietnam veteran as a crazed killer. And that really stuck with me, even though I was really young. It's like, wow, that guy's really disturbed, right? So these two rather fleeting experiences solidified one major life lesson in the mind of this American pre-adolescent. Never trust anything you see on TV. As it turned out, Nixon was lying about his involvement in Watergate. And, of course, in Hollywood, there was this horrible and false stereotype and trope that remained intact until Magnum P.I. and John Rambo, that of the crazed Vietnam serial killer. But it did change, it did shift, and again, the real credit does go to these other programs that focused on Vietnam veterans in a completely different way. And I know it's easy to be dismissive of Sylvester Stallone and Rambo. I get it, right? If you don't watch that film for his historical accuracy. However, I think one of the most powerful components of that film is at the very end. And it's when the character John Rambo goes on this rant about how he feels about his service in Vietnam, how he feels about coming home to a nation who doesn't appreciate him. Now, this is 1982. And so he goes on this rant, and it really does humanize, I think, for the American people in a very real sense, the effect and the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder on so many Vietnam veterans, which had also been recently recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-3, in 1980. So finally we're grappling with, these aren't just crazed killers, these are men who are suffering because of their experiences in combat and the way they were treated when they came home. Before we move on, the final event I'd like to mention that occurred during the same period was the building of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. This was completed and dedicated in November of 1982. While the memorial design remained hotly contested throughout the planning and construction phases, I suspect every American veteran and every veteran family member who lost someone during that war, today they cherish that memorial as sacred ground. It is powerful to see that black granite etched with the names of more than 58,000 Americans, and the completion of that memorial finally allowed an entire nation to grieve and to remember their fallen from the Vietnam War, and to do so with honor and respect. While seemingly unrelated to the normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam, and I don't mean to overstate this, but I do think that these experiences, as reflected in scholarship and popular culture and the collective American psyche, they did play a role in the American people processing both the personal and the collective trauma and grief caused by that war. When a different wall fell in 1989 in Berlin, and the Soviet Union collapsed shortly thereafter, the American people were finally in a place where they could more openly talk about what Johnson called, pardon my French, that bitch of a war. With the election of Bill Clinton in 1992, the U.S. had a president who was open to the changing and challenging new geopolitical and geoeconomic landscapes. Earlier, following Doi Moi in Vietnam and the liberalization of their economy in 1986, and with the withdrawal of Vietnamese forces from Cambodia in 1988 and 1989, Asian and European countries started to ignore U.S. diplomatic efforts to keep Vietnam isolated. By 1993, U.S. companies and businesses were being left behind as potential investors in the quickly growing business opportunities of Vietnam. While the U.S. wanted to move forward as quickly as possible in normalizing relations, post-war issues remained of concern for both sides. For the United States, lingering questions about POWs, the recovery of U.S. missing in action, dominated the discussions, as did the question of war debts that were still owed to the United States from the Republic of Vietnam when Saigon fell. That's right. We're going to get our money back, damn it. Anyway, with the fall of Saigon, those debts were assumed by, international treaties and all the rest assumed by the Social Republic of Vietnam, and of course that meant they had to pay us back. For Vietnam, the lingering questions that remained after the war were about dioxin contamination caused by U.S. defoliants and unexploded ordnance, and those were the things that dominated their post-war issues, as they continued as serious threats to the health, safety, and the lives of the Vietnamese people. 1993 served as a pivotal year as the Vietnamese government took concrete steps to address the POW-MIA issue for the United States government. This included providing previously classified files to basically flight logs and prison registries, things like that, trying to prove to the United States that they were not holding on to any additional prisoners. They also handed over 39 sets of recovered remains, to U.S. forensic teams so that they were making good on their promise to help us account for our missing. And also they provided unprecedented access to American units for field excavations within Vietnam. And then finally, they did have, in closing, 55 last known alive MIA cases to prove conclusively again that no Americans were still alive and being held in jungle prison camps. Now, this resulted in the U.S. lifting the embargo in February of 1994. Negotiations between the two countries continued, and after several other issues were addressed, to include that war debts issue and property claims and human rights, religious freedom, the United States agreed to normalize relations with full diplomatic exchanges in July of 1995. The key to that political success were two U.S. Vietnam veterans and U.S. senators, John McCain and John Kerry. Tied to the repayment of the war debts was the creation of an organization called the Vietnam Education Foundation, a program that rerouted 85 million of those dollars that Vietnam paid back to basically a fellowship program which supported Vietnamese students, hundreds of Vietnamese students, who studied and earned PhDs in STEM fields throughout the United States. With normalization, the United States and Vietnam started down a path of gradually addressing Vietnam War issues important to both sides. Vietnam continued to provide support to the United States Department of Defense in locating U.S. MIAs. While it took time, the United States eventually agreed to support dioxin remediation efforts to clean the soil from Agent Orange storage sites, first in Da Nang in 2007, and then later at Biennial in 2019. These projects have been very effective in the complete removal of dioxin from the contaminated soil at those sites, addressing a major humanitarian issue for the Vietnamese people. In addition, over time, the United States became the largest supporter of mine action centers in Vietnam, supporting demining and unexploded ordnance cleanup and education programs, especially in central Vietnam. Those programs have led to several years of zero UXO incidents, helping to address another important humanitarian issue for Vietnam, and especially for the kids in Vietnam, who just walking around in the jungle somewhere might find a cluster bomb unit, looks like a ball, let's play catch. And as you guys know, those things tumble, they eventually arm, and that's when someone either gets killed or loses a limb. It's a very important, again, humanitarian project. So as the two sides started to address those war legacy issues, the United States and Vietnam also continued to expand and enhance trade relations. With the end of the embargo and normalization of relations, the two countries turned toward developing a bilateral trade agreement, which was signed in 2000, going in full effect in 2001. And since then, Vietnamese exports, of course, have skyrocketed by just the 14,000%. And I had to do a double take of that number too when I did the calculations. Wow. But our exports also increased to Vietnam by about 4,000%. And so we're not quite the same, but still, a growing trade relationship strengthening our ties. Along with increased trade has been increased diplomacy and cooperation in other areas of mutual interest and concern. Given ongoing Chinese aggression in the East Sea of Vietnam, yes, I like to call it the East Sea. I like to give Vietnam their due instead of the South China Sea. I do that because, of course, Chinese aggression in the East Sea, along with their unreasonable and unjustifiable claims along their self-proclaimed 9-dash line, which was recently increased to a 10-dash line. For those of you who keep track of these things, you know what I'm talking about. But the U.S. lifted the non-lethal arms embargo because of that Chinese aggression in the sea, and in Vietnam in 2014, and largely caused by China infringing on Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. As China continued their aggressive policies for the next 2 years into 2016, they built shallow reefs into artificial islands, militarized them, and basically building military-grade runways and radar systems and everything else. Now they're posing a direct and significant threat to freedom of navigation in the region. As a result, the United States fully lifted the arms embargo to Vietnam in 2016, allowing for commercial military sales and also the transfer of military equipment to include Coast Guard cutters, training aircraft, and all kinds of stuff. The strategic relationship between the United States and Vietnam strengthened so quickly that Vietnam welcomed the USS John McCain, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, into Cam Ranh Bay in 2016, the first time a destroyer was in port in Vietnam. And then they, 2 years later, they allowed the USS Carl Vinson, a Nimitz-class supercarrier, into Da Nang in 2018. So very rapid development of this kind of military connections between the United States Navy and the Vietnamese Navy. Oh, these high-level military business coincided with diplomatic exchanges, a lot of Secretary of Defense visiting Vietnam, of course, and that culminated with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Vice President Harris visiting Vietnam and basically establishing a comprehensive strategic partnership. A lot went into that agreement, but the most significant for purposes of our discussion today is the war legacies issue. Because that continues. The ongoing discussions about war legacies, again, remained dioxin remediation, unexploded ordnance, but also, of course, MIAs. Vietnam continued to assist us, while at the same time the United States government expanded programs with the Vietnam Wartime Accounting Initiative to help them account for their missing. This is a direct assistance program in some ways where we have implementing partners in the United States to include Texas Tech, U.S. Mission PWMIA, a nonprofit, and also U.S. ASEAN Business Council. We all play distinct roles in helping Vietnam in this accounting mission. We, in the United States, have 1,563 missing remaining. Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the National Liberation Front have over 200,000. And so this is a Herculean effort that they're facing. We're using our archival historical resources to help them, identifying potential grave locations and things of that nature. We're also building capacity, research capacity in Vietnam, so they can continue this work into the far distant future, because it's going to take a while to account for that many people. And our partners are developing other types of programs in support of this, whether it be veteran exchanges, archival research in the National Archives, building a database of overhead imagery for both fixed wing and also satellite imagery, things like that, to help identify places where Vietnamese soldiers might be buried, both in individual, but more importantly in mass graves. So all kinds of important work now occurring between the United States and Vietnam. Let me jump ahead here. How much time do I have left? 30 seconds?
3 minutes.
Oh, okay, all right. I can do this. So the important part of the work that we're doing is in support of Vietnam's efforts. National Steering Committee 515 in Hanoi, they're responsible for the overall recovery efforts for the Vietnamese missing. And our role is basically in support. So we're the support, they're the tip of the accounting spear. And these efforts today reflect just how far the United States and Vietnam have come from being enemies to allies. In addition to the reality of addressing regional and global security issues and promoting trade and economic relations, we are working jointly and with mutual respect in addressing these important humanitarian issues for both sides, helping to heal wounds of war that we each inflicted on the other more than 50 years ago. I think this is an incredible testament to both sides, but in my heart, I am most impressed with the Vietnamese people. During the war, the United States military forces wreaked incredible havoc, destruction, and death in Vietnam, as was their job. Regardless, the Vietnamese people welcome Americans, to include Vietnam veterans, and welcome this comprehensive strategic partnership that we more recently developed. They remember the war, but they've not allowed those memories to poison what is now an incredible alliance and friendship between the nations. So I also have this PowerPoint, which I haven't used once, which is fine. I intended to fully use this as propaganda regarding our project with Texas Tech, just to tell you how awesome we are. But I'm going to leave you instead with this stuff. is a thought our founding director shared with us when he started the Vietnam Center and Archive in May of 1989. Dr. Jim Reckner, whose wife was a Kiwi. He served as a U.S. naval officer in Vietnam, serving 2 tours as an advisor to the ARVN Riverine Forces. When Jim arrived at Texas Tech, he wanted to teach classes of the Vietnam War, but didn't have the historical resources to do so. So he got together with local veterans and other supporters at Texas Tech, and they created the Vietnam Center and Archive. Our mission is simple: collect, preserve, and provide access to the history of the Vietnam War and promote education and understanding about those experiences. Given his personal experiences working with the ARVN, Jim's vision was inclusive. He didn't want to just have an American-only archive. He wanted to make sure that we included the voice of our allies, the perspectives of all participants, allies and enemies alike. And what served as Jim's passion was this: quote, "People will always need and want memorials to help mourn their fallen heroes, but it is archives that will provide answers to the lingering questions that will persist long after the last combat veteran has left us." The Vietnam Center and Archive is proud to be a part of that heritage of answering those lingering questions, while also providing solace to families of the fallen. We are also proud to be kindred spirits with the incredible library and archive here in Melbourne at the Royal United Services Institute of Victoria, under the leadership, of course, of Major General O'Brien. I enjoyed a wonderful tour, pleasure meeting with him, about a 2-hour tour of that facility. Just incredibly impressed with the breadth of their library and their amazing and unique archival holdings that chronicle the history of Australian military forces from the 19th century to the present. General O'Brien and his dedicated team are inspirational, and I look forward to staying in contact and collaborating with them in the future, as much work remains in collecting, preserving, and providing access to that history and Australia's important role in the Vietnam War. Of equal importance is our joint mission to promote education and interest in that conflict with younger generations of Americans and others, so that they remember, of course Australians, so that they remember and they never forget the sacrifices made by the generations before them. So again, thank you very much to Major General Barry, Major General O'Brien, Andrew, Military History and Heritage Victoria, and to all of you for this wonderful opportunity to visit with you today. Thank you very much. Entertain questions, yes.
Steve,
Yes, sir.
your presentation is fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
But it also begs the question, what about the missing from the Republic of Vietnam?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And it's such an important one. Of course, from our perspective, all 3 sides have to combine, right? You can't talk about the missing without looking at all nations who have soldiers who are still missing. And the Republic of Vietnam is in the same position, the same place as the North Vietnamese National Liberation Front, with approximately 200,000 missing. And the biggest challenge there, of course, is the ongoing, lingering antagonism that exists between the current government of Vietnam and the Vietnamese diaspora. Now, we work with some organizations in the United States, mostly ARVN organizations. There's one, the Vietnamese American Foundation, that we've been working with. There's also, they're based in Houston, Texas. There's others in California, Washington, all the rest. But what we're trying to do is work with those partners to develop a plan where we're collecting information now. We're working with the Vietnamese, with the older generation of Vietnamese, veterans and family members, so that we have a database of potential locations where grave sites might be located. And because the challenge right now is politically, we can't yet approach the government of Vietnam without recovering remains, but there has been some modest success already in that area. For example, we know that with the Vietnamese American Foundation, they were able to find some remains that were, mostly these were prison camp remains. So after the war ended, of course, a lot of those Vietnamese veterans found themselves in prison camps, and government officials found themselves in prison camps for many years, and many died in captivity. And so there has been some effective work done in terms of recovering some of those remains. But it's challenging. The political landscape isn't quite there yet, but Vietnam is showing signs of kind of softening that position. And so we remain hopeful, but the biggest challenge is, of course, we're losing everybody. Right? The Vietnamese veterans, the ARVN veterans, they're dying. Their family members are dying. And so we need to make sure we're working with them now to collect that information so that their children, their grandchildren, if they have those questions, hopefully we can find those answers and perhaps we can find remains for them. But it is part of the legacy, it's part of the ongoing discussion. But it is slower paced than, of course, addressing the North Vietnamese National Liberation Front and American Friends.
Yes. Thank you also for the presentation. How comprehensive are US official archives? Are they stovepipe defence, Navy, including Marine Corps, Army, Air Force? Are they disconnected? In the general sense, how easily are they accessed and how comprehensive are they from the Vietnam era?
That's a great question. So we like to pride ourselves as having the central repository, the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, right? But you're absolutely right. There's separate archival facilities for some of the military branches as well. You've got the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Center at MacDill. You've got the Marine Corps Archive and at Quantico. You've got the Navy Archive at the Washington Navy Yard. The Army is a little bit less separated in that they do have the Center for Military History and the Military History Institute, Carl, Pennsylvania, Center for Military History in Washington, but all their records are in NARA. But what's kind of interesting is they're still really accessible. You know, less so probably the Air Force. I think a little more challenging sometimes to get some of their materials, but we have a lot of it. In fact, we've got all the chipper reports and all kinds of stuff, and we've digitized that, put it online. We've digitized we've put online 1.1 million records from the Marine Corps. We've put on the ComNav 4V, Commander of Naval Forces Vietnam collections online, the command summaries, things like that. So we've got, Texas Tech has digitized and put a bunch of stuff online. Our total digitized holdings right now are just over 10 million pages. And our total archival holdings at Texas Tech are about 30 million. Now compare that to the National Archives. Record Group 472, which is basically the main collection for U.S. Armed Forces in Southeast Asia 1955 to 1975, we're looking at about 50 million pages. And on the upside, with the Vietnam Wartime Accounting Initiative project and the research that we're doing, we're also now working with NARA. And so we were planning on hiring students or perhaps archival professionals to help us digitize collections at College Park, Maryland, which is where the Vietnam War holdings reside. And we met with them, we had some really great meetings. Then all of a sudden they came back to us and said, hey, we were thinking, some of that stuff that you guys want, it's probably suitable for high-speed scanning. So we're willing to do high-speed scanning and to get a bunch of this stuff digitized if you guys are willing to do the post-processing. Heck yeah, bring it on, right? So we anticipate now receiving many thousands of pages, if not eventually millions of pages, very rapidly from the National Archives of materials exclusively from the Vietnam War records. And so they are the central repository, but there are kind of small enclaves within the military records keeping system that allow some of the military branches to keep stuff, but there's also a lot of duplication and a lot of access. But, so, I mean, I think it's probably as good as it can be in terms of access. And you sometimes still have to travel, but they've also put a lot of stuff on film, microfilm. And that's what we use. So all the Air Force stuff, we've got a microfilm and we digitize
it. Working with the Vietnamese community diaspora in Victoria, where the federal and state governments have put a combined $20 million into a Vietnamese museum of Australia that represents the story of the Boat people, and I'm with my friend Dean, who was an ARVN veteran who went through all of that. But there is, despite the general move towards that reconciliation, there was evidence at the recent 30th of April 50-year anniversary of Vietnamese students supported by the Vietnamese government putting on some provocative activities to have a bit of a go at the veterans and the diaspora community who were part of the South Vietnamese, if you like, network. So despite the moves towards that liberalisation and reconciliation, is there evidence of those sorts of provocations or activities, and does that sit well with the general movement towards liberalisation?
Well, that's a really good point. And you know, we haven't witnessed that too much in the US. I'm really sorry to hear that happened here. And I'm not sure, you know, what would be behind that. I mean, of course, there's different political organizations in Vietnam, and I guess you could say political factions, if you will, some of whom support Vietnam becoming closer to the United States, Australia, and other liberal Western democracies, if you will, and others who think Vietnam should be pushing north and having a stronger relationship with China. And so I'm not sure what would be behind that, if that would be something that would necessarily involve any kind of government.
Yeah, if I can just say, it can be as basic as which flag they fly. You know, the South Vietnamese descendants here tend to fly the yellow flag with the red stripes.
Right.
And these students were flying the official flag.
Sure.
It was a bit of a competition.
No,
rivalry under that.
absolutely, yeah, and that is an ongoing challenge, if you will, an issue in the United States. And so, you know, and that I think it's one of those politically volatile situations where obviously the former members of the Republic of Vietnam, the Vietnamese diaspora, they still hold allegiance to that flag and what it represents, whereas the United States official relationship is with the current government of Vietnam, the Social Republic of Vietnam, and of course their flag. And so a lot of loggerheads going on. You know, people just disagree. We haven't had that issue at Texas Tech. I know that's an issue in some of the larger cities in the United States. And you know, the Vietnamese government has a very specific policy about the Republic of Vietnam flag. And of course, it's not something that they allow to be shown typically in Vietnam. I will say this, whereas typically when we've traveled, for instance, on study abroad programs, taking Texas Tech students just to Vietnam, Southeast Asia, typically in museums, any representation of the Republic of Vietnam flag is typically, it's in dirt, it's in mud, you know, they show it as being a desecrated flag, right? That's typically. However, we visited about 3 or 4 years ago, for the first time we visited the Central Highlands, and we went to Ba My Thuột, now called Buôn Ma Thuột. But anyway, we went to Ba My Thuột and have a museum there. And that museum, for the first time, it showed the South Vietnamese flag on a little stick. It's just a diorama type of thing, but it showed it respectfully. And so I think there is some shifting going on in Vietnam in terms of showing at least some respect. But it's an ongoing challenge. And I'm sorry to hear that happened. I know that showing the current flag in Vietnam would certainly be perceived by many as being provocative. But I'm wondering if it wasn't necessarily meant that by the students, because they're showing their flag. And so it may be felt it's kind of in your face type of thing, but maybe that wasn't necessarily the intent. They're just showing pride. Just an alternative viewpoint. Yes?
Hi, so I'm Ashley May from Monash University. I took a group of my students to Vietnam. This was in 2016 and again in 2017. And we asked for permission to visit the site of the former South Vietnamese military cemetery at Biennial.
Yes.
And we had quite an interesting response because we didn't get permission. The guide was trying to be really helpful, so we still took the bus. I mean, this was a Monash University tour. You know, everything was done very openly. We got to the site, couldn't see anything because there was an enormous wall with barbed wire on top. All my students got out. We were there taking photographs. And then these two very beefy guys turned up on motorcycles. They were probably from the Department of Public Security, looking very, very angry. Our guide turned white. We sort of sent him back to the bus, and then we hurried on.
Sure.
And for many of my students, they studied with me. So obviously I told them about some of the issues in Vietnam. But it was their first experience of actually living through this. And some of them were, they told me afterwards, this is when they realized, I told them about one-party state, and I said, it's fine so long as you don't mention politics, it's fine so long as you don't mention democracy. But you do start noticing that flags everywhere, pictures of Ho Chi Minh everywhere, a lot of men putting uniforms not doing anything much. And suddenly you become much more aware of the undercurrent. If you go as a tourist, you're not necessarily conscious of that. But that was one issue. We did that again the next year, and we had exactly the same response. And again, a guy who wanted to be helpful. But once again, we were denied access.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And we haven't had, the only time we've ever encountered someone coming up to us and saying, hey, move along, is when we assemble near a government building. And there are actually signs that basically say, don't go gather in groups around this building. a guy with an AK-47 is going to come up and say, move along. And so that happened to us just maybe once or twice. The Biennial Cemetery, what they call now Biennial Cemetery, we had a very similar and weird experience recently. So we went back in 2024 to the cemetery with a group, and we gave services, and we took a tour of that cemetery. And when you look at what was happening to what was basically, this was the South Vietnamese National Military Cemetery. This was like their Arlington, right? This is an incredibly important historical and sacred site for the Republic of Vietnam. And it's completely overgrown. Trees everywhere, root systems pulling up and destroying grave sites. It's in horrific condition, horrific state of affairs. They have started to allow families to come in and renovate individual grave sites. I know the Vietnamese American Foundation in the United States, along with some others, have been petitioning both the embassy, the Vietnamese embassy in Washington, D.C., and coming to Vietnam to try to persuade them to allow a private renovation project where they're going to raise money externally and then help to renovate this cemetery and rebuild some of these tombs and other things. And so a lot of effort there. We've got a retired Rear Admiral in the United States. His name is Juan Nguyen. His family was massacred during the Hue massacre. Sole survivor of his family was like 8 years old. He, in the United States, became this incredibly successful naval officer. And now his passion is to try to help with these types of issues. And you're just an incredible gentleman. And so he's been very active in this, so we've traveled with him and done some things with him. But the more recent experience we had was just this past April. So we had made arrangements to go again to the Biennial Cemetery. And we show up with a little bus, and the guard at the gate said, no, you can't come in. It's like, well, we already made arrangements. What do you mean we can't come in? No, you can't come in. So we just walked. We didn't have that confrontation. But yeah, it happens. There's still very much a kind of a very, I wouldn't say necessarily closed, but they certainly are reluctant, and also a lot of fear. That is, if they allow the wrong person in, and that person takes film, and that film becomes something of a controversy, then whoever let that group in, they're in trouble, right? So there's a lot of risk aversion going on in that kind of situation. But they don't want to get themselves in trouble with the authorities. And so, but I think you're also right about the MPS guys. Yeah, they're all over the place. But thank you again for sharing that.
Steve, you mentioned the reception of the returning Vietnam veterans back to America. I'd be interested to hear your comments in relation to the reception they received from the World War II and Korean American veterans.
Well, that's a really good question. Of course, World War II, it was this massive victory parade, right? I mean, we won that war. All of us, right? We beat Germany, we beat Japan, we beat Italy, we beat all the enemies that we were facing in that conflict. And so big parades and welcome home and everything else. Of course, there were still a lot of veterans who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. But I think for the World War II generation of veterans, I think they had this kind of built-in mechanism of decompression, where, with Vietnam, you went to war, and then your 365 was over, you got on a plane and you went home, in many cases. No time for decompression, no time for processing those experiences, especially with other veterans. World War II, you're on troop transports. You've got weeks at sea, and you're talking about your experiences, and you're kind of going through them. And you're with other people who shared those experiences. And so kind of a natural decompression. We see that in terms of a lower incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder with career veterans from Vietnam. So again, they stay in the military, they're still with other veterans, and they're still able to kind of talk through those experiences and process those experiences, so perhaps helping them to adjust to those experiences. For the average American draftee who just found themselves in Vietnam one day and home the next, a little exaggeration, but effectively, yeah, that was a much tougher thing. Korean War veterans return, that's a really good question. And the Korean War wasn't a war for the American people. It was conflict, right? It was a police action. So it was a war. I mean, when you look at what was going on the ground in Korea, this was a fighting war. People were killing and dying and everything else. No difference from any other war. But the mindset, I think, was quite different. I suspect the Korean veterans felt very much like Vietnam veterans, returning to a country that was not very appreciative of their service, and of course, returning to a country where their Korean War experiences were so immediately overshadowed by what happened in Vietnam. And so kind of completely pushed to the side once that war kicked off. And then the Vietnam veterans coming home to that feeling of, again, being isolated and pushed aside and not being recognized for their service. I think one of the most remarkable things from the Vietnam veteran community was their response to what happened with the first Gulf War and then the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when those wars happened, we started getting correspondence from Vietnam veterans and associations that we dealt with. And they were like, just remember, don't blame the veteran. Don't blame the veteran for the war. Blame the policymakers, blame the politicians. And make sure you welcome those veterans home. And so to a person, Vietnam veterans in the United States were constantly referencing this importance of, you've got to thank the veterans who come back. You've got to make sure they realize that their service is appreciated. And don't treat them like we would treat them. And so, and as a result, the nation did respond differently to the returning veterans, even though the rotation systems were very similar. And I think that's one of the challenges. Of course, First World War, Second World War, even the Korean War, we had men and women serving throughout the duration. And then all of a sudden in Vietnam, you're there for one rotation, 365 days, and you're out, or a little bit more for Marines, 13 months for Marines. But the impact of that constant rotation, individual replacement, all that kind of stuff, I think it wreaked havoc on morale, and especially on the veteran return experience.
Thank you. Stephen, I have contact with a few Americans visiting Australia, and I find that they're either completely unaware of Australia's involvement in Vietnam or surprised at the level of involvement in Vietnam. Is that a general public position, and what do your students know before they start your courses?
Well, that's a really excellent question. I suspect that most of them have no idea about the Vietnam War. Right? And in terms of history classes taught at university, so we have military history, general military history courses, and we have a history of the Vietnam War, things like that. The students who come into those first introductory level history classes, that is military history, probably have some general understanding of the war. But American high schools don't spend a lot of time talking about it. It's like maybe 15 minutes out of a full year of teaching American history, if that. And so it's minimal. And they're doing such, there's just no way you can cover that conflict in so little time. If it's a full day, it's too much to cover. And so most of them are entering university with actually no understanding of the role of allies, the role of Australia or anybody else. When I teach the history of the war, especially as part of our military history class, I talk all about our allies, and I do talk about, of course, Australia. And more recently, I've started introducing some more specific aspects of that service to include Phu Thuy and Long Tan, things like that, to make sure that there's an understanding of the level of sacrifice that Australian forces faced and contributed to that effort. But it's not the norm. It's unfortunate, but there's just such ignorance among most of our citizens about the history of the American War in Vietnam and the role of others in it.
Thank you.
We've still got a little time before morning tea is timetabled, so if there are any more questions.
Vietnam's often viewed as the war that could never be won. It was a nationalist war of reunification of the country. And yet, if you look at Korea and the Republic of China, Taiwan, you could argue they were the same things. And yet, in both cases, America backed a right-wing military dictatorship that turned into a prosperous liberal democracy. So why was Vietnam different?
Oh, that's a really good question. How much time do I have? Wow. Well, I think there's a lot of, there's certainly similarities between Vietnam and, of course, the other conflicts you mentioned. I would say that the biggest differences, of course, between Korea, nationalist China, and Vietnam is the fact that you have water surrounding those other two nations. It's the ability to do a naval blockade and have complete control over what's happening around those two countries, the Korean Peninsula, and of course Taiwan. It allows for insulation, right? And allows for a stronger defense, an easier defense, and of course then allows for more control. Korea, of course, is across the parallel. So we've got the military forces facing off across the DMZ. ever since the armistice. But we're able to control any kind of sea lanes in. As a result, all we're doing is that shorter, of course, DMZ area using military forces, mostly, of course, rock forces, but also some US and others. And so I think there's a big difference between those two experiences and how we were able to defend them and what happened in Vietnam. You know, and I'm sure this is going to come up in our session on was the war winnable, which is going to be coming up here shortly, I guess. But when you look at what was happening, the complexity of what was happening in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, it wasn't so easy to say, okay, we'll just do a complete block of the entirety of the Southeast Asian peninsula from the east coast of Vietnam all the way to the border with Thailand, you know, across Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. And that wasn't so simple. It wasn't so easy. I mean, of course, there are those who make that argument, well, that's all we needed to do. Well, they're completely ignoring the international geopolitical landscape of both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China threatening to go across and fight with the Vietnamese if we did that. So do we want a massive land war, like we had when MacArthur went up to the Alma River in Korea? Do we want another massive ground war against massive Asian armies and the incredible loss of life that would result from that? You know, for the United States, arguably that's our most significant Achilles heel, is casualties. And we're willing to sacrifice if the cause is just and we are righteous in our mission and we know we're fighting the good fight because they attacked us. World War I, not so much. World War II, right? That's the big one, right? Attack on Pearl Harbor, declarations of war from the other three sides. Okay, yeah, now we're at it, right? We're going to fight to the very last. But Vietnam wasn't that. It wasn't a total war. And it was hard, I think, for the American people to jump on board with this idea that, oh yeah, we'll just do a massive draft, mobilize the reserves, and have this huge army from the coast to the Thai border. And then, of course, the military operations that would have resulted in incredible losses. And so, again, I think there's a lot that we can discuss about that, and we can certainly talk about that when we talk about was the war winnable, but I understand your point, but I think there's still differences between the two, or between the three, excuse me. But we can talk about it.
But did it lull America in a false sense of security that they thought they could do?
Oh,
they had one.
well, okay, yeah. Well, first, I think, you know, the primary premise of American involvement in Southeast Asia was that there was no way we could lose, right? How could we possibly lose against these backward little fighters, right? They're small, they're not well armed, some of them are using muskets for crying out loud, right? I mean, how could they possibly win against us, the great might of the American military? And so the hubris, right, of going into that conflict, thinking, oh yeah, it'll be a cakewalk. There's no way they can resist our power. And of course, learning quite the opposite as the war dragged on and on. And for every high-tech military piece of equipment we had, they had a low-tech solution to counter it. That's the art of the guerrilla. Art of guerrilla fighting guerrilla warfare.
I'm just saying that the Vietnamese, they've come to Australia, they assimilated very well. They came as proper refugees, unlike what people come these days, and they fit in very, very well with the Australian population. I think to that extent there's a better perception in Australia of what happened in Vietnam as a result of that, because these people in Australia are doing very well. That's just the comment.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering about the ideological sort of issues of the fight in Vietnam was presented as an anti-communist war in some senses. And there are not that many communist states left now, but Vietnam, I guess, is one of them. And it's just curious that you're saying that there is a strategic partnership between America and Vietnam, notwithstanding that this is a communist country. So I'm just wondering what happened to the ideological issues that caused the intervention in Vietnam in the first place?
That's a really great question. I mean, of course, one of the myths of the Cold War was that communism was this massive monolithic movement. Yeah. And what we learned, of course, is that no, it's not. And I think one of the great things that the more recent scholars, the internationalists, the Vietnam-centric scholars, have been able to reveal is that the relationship between North Vietnam and the PRC and the Soviet Union was just as complex and just as challenging for them as was the relationship between the United States and the Republic of Vietnam and the leadership in that country. I mean, of course, Kennedy had his hands full trying to wrangle Zim and keep him under control in some way. And then Johnson had the same problems with the revolving door generals who took over and then eventually, President Pugh. And so, you know, we have this notion that, oh, well, we're providing them with aid, we're providing them with support, they need to do what we say. And of course, they're like, no, we don't. And by the way, you've got a lot of skin in this game, you've got a lot of diplomatic face in this game. And so if you screw up, you're going to lose just as much as we are. And the same thing was happening between the North Vietnamese and the PRC and Soviet Union. They were able to manipulate those relationships. They were able to play one off the other. And so there was a lot of give and take there. And again, the complexities of that relationship really come through in that more recent scholarship. And it gets to this question of, again, was communism this monolithic thing? Did the Soviet Union and PRC completely control Ho Chi Minh or Lê Duan or anybody else in North Vietnam? Absolutely not. And of course, they had their own ideals and they had their own goals and aims, and they were, whether or not some people want to accept it, they were just as nationalist as Ngo Dinh Diem. Ho Chi Minh was fighting a nationalist war for liberation against the French and then the Japanese and the French again. They wanted that freedom. They wanted that standalone national identity to have Vietnam for the Vietnamese people. And I think that's one of the major miscalculations that the United States made, and not fully understanding just how deep Vietnamese nationalism had taken hold, both in North and South Vietnam. But it wasn't just about communism. I mean, it was for us, right? For the United States and for our allies. Well, we just got to stop the spread of communism. It's about the domino theory. It's about, you know, all that stuff. The policy of containment. All those things were part of the Cold War dynamic and policies of the United States. But that's not how the Vietnamese were doing it, by any stretch. Yes, sir.
If the President Wilson did not resign because of the Watergate, and if the Congress did not cut $700 million to support the Saudi war, did we still not do it?
That's a good question. And you know, I think one of the biggest challenges facing Vietnam after Nixon's resignation, in addition to losing the support, the financial support, military support that Congress did cut back on, was also the removal of U.S. air power as an asset. And one of the most significant things that happens in 1973, or 1972, excuse me, the Eastern Offensive, is the use of American military air power to completely decimate the North Vietnamese forces that make this really idiotic decision. We're going to go fully conventional and put all of our forces, to include tanks, out in the open. Right? And then American air power is still there, and we just literally destroy and decimate their forces. It takes them 2 years, almost 3 years, to rebuild so they can resume their assault into southern Vietnam. And so that was just an incredible mistake. But whether or not Vietnam could have held on militarily without that level of air power support to, again, decimate those conventional forces in the open, I'm not sure. That's one of those. I will say this, you know, and I think JV does a wonderful job in Black April of showing just how hard the South Vietnamese forces continue to fight to the very end, and with incredible bravery and very tenaciously and effectively, facing overwhelming odds. The South Vietnamese military forces continued that fight and only withdrew when they had no other choice. So had the United States continued to support them and fund them, like the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union had continued to support the North, maybe that war would have been fought to a stance. That's one of the rare notes.
The reason why I ask that question, because the war started after 1955. And from 1955 to 1974, 19 years, South Vietnam only lost one province. Only lost one province. That's the Phu Long province. But from 74 to 75, only 2-3 months without funding, without a commitment from the president, we lost everything. That's the reason why I asked this question.
Yeah, but I think there's legitimacy to that question and that perspective. And I think the other thing we need to remember too is just how impactful and devastating the Paris Peace Accords were. You know, when we signed those accords without Vietnam's support, and when we basically threw them under the bus, right? And we allowed North Vietnam to maintain its territory that it captured during the Eastern Offensive without pushing them back across the border into North Vietnam. I mean, these were major diplomatic and military and strategic mistakes. And, you know, Nixon and Kissinger, of course, behind all that, incredible, just terrible mistakes, and did, of course, the South Vietnamese a tremendous injustice. So unfair, so appropriate. Larry Berman's book, No Peace, No Honor, devastates both Nixon and Kissinger on those grounds. There was no peace, there was no honor in that case.
Do the Americans have the domino theory like Australia did, that we have to fight them there, otherwise best to fight them there rather than Australia? They have some sort of domino theory, one falls, the other will fall, blah, blah, blah.
Oh, yes, sir, absolutely. It was exactly the same. For the United States, the perception was if South Vietnam falls, then of course, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, eventually India, that massive continent, that would be, of course, devastating to the Western world. All of these nations fall into communism like dominoes fall. Of course, that doesn't happen, but you know the question is why. And when, of course, Cambodia falls eventually to communism, but and Vietnam invades Cambodia because of the Khmer Rouge genocide that comes across the border to Tobruk into Vietnam. And of course, they do become communists for a while, but then they become basically they're still a monarchy in Cambodia, but they're also a parliamentary system. So the dominoes didn't fall quite the way that we anticipated or feared. Not to say that they wouldn't have if we hadn't fought, right? And that's part of that ongoing debate. Had the United States not made such a strong stand in South Vietnam, what would have happened? Would the dominoes have fallen? And we'll never know the answer to that. I think there's a legitimate question there. And we had to make a stand to prove to not just our South Vietnamese allies, but the Western world and also the communist world that we will fight if necessary.
I think we could call a halt there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Again, thank you all very much. You know, my luggage was getting really light. No, thank you very much.
And I think you might find that morning tea is on the table.
Wonderful.